Okay, this is chapter 10 of volume 2, Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen, or chapter 33 if you do not have a book that is divided into volumes. More than once did Elizabeth in her ramble within the park unexpectedly meet Mr. Darcy. So we know that Elizabeth likes to walk in the, not just the park, but the gardens, and, she found her favorite walk path, and, she likes it there. She visits that path often, but now she meets Mr. Darcy there, accidentally or unexpectedly. She felt all the perverseness of the mischance that should bring him where no one else was brought. She's like, what? Nobody else comes here. Why is he here? And to prevent its ever happening again, took care to inform him at first that it was a favorite haunt of hers. So she's like, okay, I'm going to tell him, like, Mr. Darcy, this is my favorite walking path, just letting you know, because she is so sure that if he knows she likes to walk there, that he won't walk there. How it could occur a second time, therefore, was very odd. Yet it did, and even a third. He keeps going. It seemed like willful ill nature or voluntary penance. For on these occasions, it was not merely a few formal inquiries and an awkward pause and then away, but he actually thought it necessary to turn back and walk with her. So whenever they met, she thought it was going to be like, okay, like they're meeting. Hey, oh, hi, how are you? Doing well? Very good. And then just keep going. But no, Mr. Darcy ended up walking with her. You know what I'm saying? So that's strange. Or does it mean something? He never said a great deal, nor did she give herself the trouble of talking or of listening much. So do they have that comfortable silence as they walk? Is that what they're saying? Or maybe it's not comfortable. I don't know. But it struck her in the course of their third rencontre that he was asking some odd, unconnected questions about her pleasure in being at Hunsford, her love of solitary walks, and her opinion of Mr. and Mrs. Collins's happiness, and that in speaking of Rosings and her not perfectly understanding the house, he seemed to expect that whenever she came into Kent again, she would be staying there too. Why would he imply that she would be staying at Rosings? She would be staying at her cousin's house, which is Mr. Collins, or her friend's house, which is Charlotte Collins, right? So why would he start saying that, oh, the next time she goes, she's going to be staying at Rosings? In what situation would she stay at Rosings? I know one situation. His words seemed to imply it. Could he have Colonel Fitzwilliam in his thoughts? So she's like, well, maybe he thinks that Colonel Fitzwilliam's going to ask me to marry him or something. I mean, that's the only way I would come back and stay at Rosings if I married one of her nephews, right? She supposed if he meant anything, he must mean an allusion to what might arise in that quarter. She's like, well, maybe he thinks we're going to get married. It distressed her a little, and she was quite glad to find herself at the gate in the pales opposite the parsonage. She was engaged one day as she walked in reperusing Jane's last letter and dwelling on some passages which proved that Jane had not written in spirits, when instead of being again surprised by Mr. Darcy, she saw on looking up that Colonel Fitzwilliam was meeting her. Putting away the letter immediately and forcing a smile, she said, I did not know before that you ever walked this way. I have been taking the tour of the park, he replied, as I generally do every year, and intend to close it with a call at the parsonage. Are you going much further? So he's like, no, I walk, every time I come here, I walk the parks at least once, and I was going to end up at your cousin's house. No, I should have turned in a moment. And accordingly, she did turn, and they walked towards the parsonage together. Do you certainly leave Kent on Saturday? Said she. Yes, if Darcy does not put it off again. Oh, so he's put off leaving once already? But I am at his disposal. He arranges the business just as he pleases, and if not able to please himself in the arrangement, he has at least great pleasure in the power of choice. I do not know anybody who seems more to enjoy the power of doing what he likes than Mr. Darcy. He likes to have his own way very well, replied Colonel Fitzwilliam, but so we all do. It is only that he has better means of having it than many others because he is rich, and many others are poor. I speak feelingly. A younger son, you know, must be inured to self-denial and dependence. So Colonel Fitzwilliam tells her, like, yeah, everybody wants to do what they want. He's like, Darcy can because he's rich. He's like, I'm a younger son, so I don't have that pleasure, you know, of doing whatever I want because I'm not rich. Or he's a younger son, meaning that he has older brothers, so maybe the older brothers got the inheritance, you know, so there's really not much left for him. So in my opinion, the younger son of an earl can know very little of either. Now, seriously, what have you ever known of self-denial and dependence? When have you been prevented by want of money from going wherever you chose, or procuring anything you had a fancy for? These are home questions, and perhaps I cannot say that I have experienced many hardships of that nature, but in matters of greater weight, I may suffer from the want of money. Younger sons cannot marry where they like, unless where they like women of fortune, which I think they very often do. So they're basically saying that the younger sons they can't really marry wherever they want or whoever they want. They might need to marry for money because the older brothers take the money. Our habits of expense make us too dependent, and there are not many in my rank of life who can afford to marry without some attention to money. So he's like, yeah, the way that we spend, I mean, I have to marry for money, you know, or at least have to pay attention to the money and what a woman or my bride would be able to bring into the marriage. Is this, thought Elizabeth, meant for me? And she colored at the idea, like she blushed. She's like, wait, are you talking to me about this? Like, are you trying to basically explain to me like why we can't be together? Is that what you're talking about? Because I wonder, is that what you mean? So she colored at the idea, but recovering herself, said in a lively tone, and pray, what is the usual price of an earl's younger son? Unless the older brother is very sickly, I suppose you would not ask above 50,000 pounds. He answered her in the same style, and the subject dropped. To interrupt a silence which might make him fancy her affected with what had passed, she soon afterwards said, so she wanted to say something else right away because she didn't want him to think that her feelings were hurt about this at all, because I really don't think they are. I imagine your cousin brought you down with him chiefly for the sake of having somebody at his disposal. I wonder he does not marry to secure a lasting convenience of that kind, but perhaps his sister does as well for the present, and as she is under his sole care, he may do what he likes with her. No, said Colonel Fitzwilliam, that is an advantage which he must divide with me. I am joined with him in the guardianship of Miss Darcy. So Darcy doesn't have guardianship over his sister. Solely. He shares guardianship with his cousin, Colonel Fitzwilliam, and I wonder why they made it like that. Why not just Darcy? Or maybe, I don't know. Are you indeed? And pray, what sort of guardians do you make? Does your charge give you much trouble? Young ladies of her age are sometimes a little difficult to manage, and if she has the true Darcy spirit, she may like to have her own way. As she spoke, she observed him looking at her earnestly, and the manner in which he immediately asked her why she supposed Miss Darcy likely to give them any uneasiness convinced her that she had somehow or other got pretty near the truth. She directly replied, you need not be frightened. I never heard any harm of her, and I dare say she is one of the most tractable creatures in the world. She is a very great favorite with some ladies of my acquaintance, Mrs. Hurst and Miss Bingley. I think I have heard you say that you know them. I know them a little. Their brother is a pleasant gentleman-like man. He is a great friend of Darcy's. Oh, yes, said Elizabeth dryly. Mr. Darcy is uncommonly kind to Mr. Bingley and takes a prodigious deal of care of him. Care of him? Yes, I really believe Darcy does take care of him in those points where he most wants care. From something that he told me in our journey hither, I have reason to think Bingley very much indebted to him, but I ought to beg his pardon, for I have no right to suppose that Bingley was the person meant. It was all conjecture. So Colonel Fitzwilliam has some, I guess, chisme about how Darcy helped Bingley with something. And he's like, well, maybe I shouldn't suppose it's Bingley. He never actually said Bingley's name, but I think it was Bingley. So Elizabeth's like, huh? What is it you mean? It is a circumstance which Darcy, of course, would not wish to be generally known, because if it were to get around to the lady's family, it would be an unpleasant thing. You may depend upon my not mentioning it. She's like, oh, you can tell me. I won't say anything. And remember that I have not much reason for supposing it to be Bingley. What he told me was merely this, that he congratulated himself on having lately saved a friend from the inconveniences of a most imprudent marriage, but without mentioning names or any other particulars, and I only suspected it to be Bingley from believing him the kind of young man to get into a scrape of that sort, and from knowing them to have been together the whole of last summer. He's like, yeah, he never said it was Bingley, but I'm pretty sure it is, because they were together last summer. But basically, Darcy prides himself in saving his friend from like a terrible marriage or a terrible match. Did Mr. Darcy give you his reasons for this interference? He's like, well, did Mr. Darcy say why he did this for his friend? I understood that there were some very strong objections against the lady. There were just some things about this person that he was going to marry were not to Bingley's favor. It wasn't really a good match. And what arts did he use to separate them? So Elizabeth wants to know, like, well, what did he do to separate them? Like, how did he do it? He did not talk to me of his own art, said Fitzwilliam, smiling. He only told me what I have now told you. Elizabeth made no answer and walked on, her heart swelling with indignation. After watching her a little, Fitzwilliam asked her why she was so thoughtful. I am thinking of what you have been telling me, said she. Your cousin's conduct does not suit my feelings. Why was he to be the judge? Are you rather disposed to call his interference officious? I do not see what right Mr. Darcy had to decide on the propriety of his friend's inclination, or why upon his own judgment alone he was determined and direct in what manner that friend was to be happy. She's like, so why is it up to Mr. Darcy about how his friend should be happy? And why is Mr. Darcy the only one able to determine what happiness is for his friend? But she continued, recollecting herself, as we know none of the particulars, it is not fair to condemn him. It is not to be supposed that there was much affection in the case. That is not an unnatural surmise, said Fitzwilliam, but it is lessening the honor of my cousin's triumph very sadly. This was spoken jestingly, but it appeared to her so just a picture of Mr. Darcy that she would not trust herself with an answer, and therefore, abruptly changing the conversation, talked on in different matters till they reached the parsonage. There, shut into her own room, as soon as their visitor left them, she could think without interruption of all that she had heard. It was not to be supposed that any other people could be meant than those with whom she was connected. She's like, no, it has to be Jane and Bingley. It has to be them. There could not exist in the world two men over whom Darcy could have such boundless influence. That he had been concerned in the measures taken to separate Mr. Bingley and Jane, she had never doubted, but she had always attributed to Miss Bingley the principal design and arrangement of them. She's like, yeah, I always knew Darcy didn't want Bingley with Jane, but I didn't think he was the one who thought of the whole scheme of it. I thought it was Miss Bingley. If his own vanity, however, did not mislead him, he was the cause. His pride and caprice were the cause of all that Jane had suffered and still continued to suffer. He had ruined for a while every hope of happiness for the most affectionate, generous heart in the world, and no one could say how lasting an evil he might have inflicted. Oh, man, Elizabeth is so mad at Darcy. She's so upset with him. She's like, it's because of him that my sister is suffering. It is because of him that she has no hope now, that her heart is broken. She is so mad. There were some very strong objections against the lady, were Colonel Fitzwilliam's words, and these strong objections probably were her having one uncle who was a country attorney and another who was in business in London. To Jane herself, she exclaimed, there could be no possibility of objection. All loveliness and goodness as she is, So Elizabeth's like, no, there's nothing wrong with Jane herself. It's probably just her family. Her understanding, excellent. She's talking about Jane here. Her mind improved and her manners captivating. Neither could anything be urged against my father, who, though with some peculiarities, has abilities which Mr. Darcy himself need not disdain. So she's like, it's not Jane. It's not my dad. It must be my uncles and their jobs, that are beneath him. She says, in respectability, which he will probably never reach. Talking about the dad again. When she thought of her mother, indeed, her confidence gave way a little, but she would not allow that any objections there had material weight with Mr. Darcy, whose pride she was convinced would receive a deeper wound from the want of importance in his friends' connections than from their want of sense. And she was quite decided at last that he had been partly governed by this worst kind of pride, and partly by the wish of retaining Mr. Bingley for his sister. She's like, no, it's just Mr. Darcy being selfish. He wants Bingley for his own sister. The agitation and tears which the subject occasioned brought on a headache. So Elizabeth was just crying and crying. Like, she really is upset and she's hurt for Jane. And she cried so much she got a headache. I mean, have you ever done that? I mean, I think I've done that a few times in my life where I'm just like bawling my eyes out and my brain hurts. And it grew so much worse. She's talking about the headache. And it grew so much worse towards the evening that, added to her unwillingness to see Mr. Darcy, it determined her not to attend her cousins to Rosings, where they were engaged to drink tea. Mrs. Collins, seeing that she was really unwell, did not press her to go, and as much as possible prevented her husband from pressing her. But Mr. Collins could not conceal his apprehension of Lady Catherine's being rather displeased by her staying home. Like, dude, the girl has a headache and it's really bad. Leave her alone. She doesn't have to go.